Good evening. My name is Paul Rudensky. I'm the Senior Director for Education here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm pleased to welcome all of you this evening. Our program tonight is entitled The Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, the Afterlife of the Revolt. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was a watershed event in the history of the Holocaust. The poorly armed and besieged ghetto fighters battled the German forces for about a month in April and May of 1943. Today, we see the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as a source of awe and inspiration. But how were they viewed during the war? And how were they viewed afterwards? Tonight, we will explore these issues as well as learn more about the uprising itself and its immediate aftershocks. Our speaker this evening is Professor Avi Patt. Professor Patt is the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. Before coming to the University of Connecticut, he was professor at the University of Hartford, where he was also director of the Museum of Jewish Civilization. Previously, he worked at the Miles Lerman Applied Research Scholar for Jewish Life and Culture at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He is the author of Finding Home and Homeland, Jewish Youth and Zionism in the Aftermath of the Holocaust, co-editor of We Are Here, New Approaches into the Study of Displaced Persons in Post-War Germany. He is also the director of In Our Words interview project with the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. Professor Patt is co-editor of an anthology of contemporary American Jewish fiction entitled The New Diaspora, The Changing Landscape of American Jewish Fiction. He is co-editor of a volume on the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee at 100, A Century of Humanitarianism. And also the author of the recently completed The Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, The Afterlife of the Revolt, which will be published by Wayne State University Press this spring. He is two more, together with David Slutsky and Gabriel Finder. He's the co-editor of a new volume, Laughter After, Humor in the Holocaust, which came out in April 2020, and with Laura Hilton, he's the co-editor of a new volume, Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust. Professor Patt is a good friend of the museum and a good friend of the educators we work with. We are honored that he is joining us today. I'd like to put in a quick plug for our upcoming lectures. On Sunday, December 13th and Sunday, December 20th at 1 p.m. on each day, we have the Fania Gottesfeld Heller Conference, which is about art and the Holocaust. And all of you should have received emails about that, and I hope you'll join us for those programs. On Tuesday, December 15th at 4 p.m., Rebecca Coburn will explore the United States refugee policy and anti-Semitism, 1924 to 1954. On Tuesday, January 19th, Martin Dean will speak on Following the Evidence to Babi Yar, about a reconstruction of the topography of Babi Yar. Our plan for today is as follows. Professor Patt will speak for approximately 40 minutes, after which time we will invite questions from the teachers attending the program. We will try to keep the program to an hour in length. Please feel free to use the chat function at the end of the program to submit questions, which we will read after the lecture. After the lecture today, we will send a link to an online evaluation form. Please spend a few minutes completing it. Your feedback is important to us, and it's important to our funder. Speaking of our funder, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Conference on Material Jewish Claims Against Germany for funding today's program. Without further ado, I would like to hand the microphone over, so to speak, to our speaker, Professor Avi Patt.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for inviting me to join the museum for this series of lectures. It's actually sounds like a wonderful lineup of speakers that you have coming up, so I'm honored to be included in this, and
thank you.
Making a note to myself to shorten my bio, so you don't have to read all of that for the next time. I'm going to talk to you this evening about the topic of what is my newest book, which will be coming out in just a few months, that's called The Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, The Afterlife of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And as Paul said, I do want to leave plenty of time at the end for questions, and I'd be happy if people have questions as you go to feel free to type those into the chat, and I'll be happy to take them. And I'm also quite curious to hear from educators their thoughts on how what I'm sharing with you this evening in my talk about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising you would use in your own teaching in the classroom. So if you can give it some thought as I'm talking about how you might use this material in the classroom, I'd be interested to hear about that. And I'll just mention before I begin that a plug for another book that I've just recently co-edited, that as this is an audience of educators in particular that might be of interest. It's called Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust. And it's specifically geared to thinking about how to take the newest research, both from historians and educators, to teach about the history of the Holocaust. So I just wanted to highlight that new book. I'm going to share my screen because I have a number of images that I want to share with you as part of my presentation. So let's just put this in slideshow mode. There we go. Okay, so as many of you likely know, in 2018, we marked the 75th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which broke out on April 19th, 1943, the first night of Passover, when the Jewish Fighting Organization in Warsaw engaged in guerrilla warfare against the combined power of the German army, Ukrainian auxiliaries, and the SS. The Jewish Fighting Organization surprised the enemy before SS General Jürgen Stroop eventually switched to burning down the entire ghetto, one building at a time, finally crushing the revolt. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as the first mass revolt in a major city in Nazi-occupied Europe, became a symbol of Jewish resistance to Nazi oppression, inspiring similar revolts in Białystok and Minsk, as well as uprisings in Treblinka and Sobibor later in 1943. The Jewish fighters in Warsaw, under-equipped and overmatched, with few weapons and almost no military training, isolated and surrounded by an indifferent and often hostile population, malnourished and diseased, managed to hold off the German forces for as long as the entire Polish army had in the invasion of Poland at the beginning of the war. But it was not enough. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising would become the focal point of Holocaust memory in the aftermath of the Shoah in both Israel and America, with the date of April 19th used to mark Holocaust commemorations annually for years after the war. On the 5th anniversary of the revolt, the famous Rapaport monument, or the monument to the ghetto heroes, which you can see here, was dedicated in Warsaw. And in 1951, Israel's Knesset designated the 27th of Nisan, which was 13 days after the uprising began, the 27th of the Hebrew month of Nisan, 13 days after the revolt began, so that it would not conflict with Passover. This date was designated as the official date of Holocaust remembrance, Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, the day of the destruction and of the heroism. On April 19th, 1951, a statue of Mordechai Anilevich, and I'll come back to that, the Warsaw monument. On April 19th, 1951, a statue of Mordechai Anilevich was unveiled at Kibbutz Yad Mordechai, the Negev kibbutz bearing his name, and a commemorative stamp bearing his image was released. In 1953, the Knesset passed the Yad Vashem law on the 10th anniversary of the revolt. And here's a picture of Mordechai Anilevich from before the war. It might seem obvious that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising would become, in the words of historian Hasia Diner, quote, the prism through which Jews around the world understood and interpreted the murder of European Jewry during the Holocaust, or would be perceived, in the words of Yisrael Gutman, a Holocaust survivor from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and a prominent historian, as, quote, a revolution in Jewish history, unquote. But how and why did this happen? Why would April 19th become the date of collective remembrance instead of, for example, November 9th, Kristallnacht, September 1st, the outbreak of World War II, September 29th and 30th, which you'll hear a lecture about in just a few weeks on Babi Yar, July 22nd, which was the date of the beginning of the Great Deportations, from the Warsaw Ghetto to the extermination camp at Treblinka, or for that matter, June 6th, D-Day, or here we are today on December 7th, a date that would live in infamy in the American memory of World War II. Or think about what has become a more recently prominent date on the calendar, January 27th, the liberation of Auschwitz. All of these dates have significance, and all of these dates carry different meanings in terms of how we think of the memory of the Holocaust. Indeed, it's not self-evident that one date would be chosen over another. But the answer to this question tells us a lot about how a society chooses to use its history, to use its past in the service of its present and its future, the process by which collective memory continuously negotiates between available historical records in the present and current social and political agendas. Now, what my research on this topic has found is that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, because of the timing of its outbreak, the unprecedented coverage that it received, and the dedicated work of surviving ghetto fighters to tell their story, became the focus of widespread attention in America and in the Yishuv in Palestine, what would become the State of Israel, immediately after it occurred. And that the event itself did little as an event to revolutionize the ways in which Jews perceive their position in the world, but instead seemed to confirm existing viewpoints and was interpreted accordingly. That is, different groups of Jews utilized the memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in different ways to suit their political needs. Furthermore, it would take more than a year for some members of the Zionist movement to seize upon the event in purely Zionist terms as part of the struggle for the creation of the state. And then, not until the aftermath of the war would the uprising be linked by survivors with the creation of the Jewish state. For the first year after the war, in fact, the most celebrated hero of the revolt was not Mordechai Anilevich, but instead was the Bundist activist Michal Klepfish, as the revolt came to symbolize the Jewish contribution to the Allied war effort in freedom struggle against fascism and totalitarianism. Now, I would venture to guess that most people have never heard of Michal Klepfish, but if you asked anyone in the first year after the revolt who was responsible for organizing the revolt, his name would have been the one that was most likely to be cited. We can discuss this in the Q&A. Now, how did the context of April 1943 shape public perception of the news of the revolt soon after it broke out? Jews in the free world entered 1943 with the news that European Jewry was in the process of, quote, complete annihilation, unquote, throughout occupied Europe, and they felt largely powerless to stop it. There were screaming headlines. There were memorial pageants like the We Will Never Die pageant, which I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A. And these events marked the transition from calls for rescue to calls for commemoration as Jews around the world came to understand the enormity of the destruction by the end of 1942 and the beginning of 1943. Before the outbreak of fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto on April 19, 1943, however, the other major news item that captured the attention of the world press was the ill-fated Bermuda Conference, convened in response to urgent demands to rescue what was left of European Jewry. As the Jewish Frontier, a labor Zionist publication in America, noted in an editorial in May 1943 titled, quote, "The Gentleman at Bermuda," Hitler has won another victory at Bermuda, a moral political victory in which Nazism rejoices. And I'll skip down. This so-called refugee conference has made a mockery not only of the agony of millions of helpless human beings, but of the great cause of liberation to which the democratic world is committed and which alone makes the horror of our time understandable and endurable. And indeed, there was a great deal of anger that in the midst of the realization that European Jewry was being destroyed, nothing was being done on the part of the world powers to save European Jewry. So the revolt, when news of it came out, was set against a context of complete despair, not only on the part of Warsaw Jewry, alone and abandoned with the knowledge that the final liquidation was inevitable, but also on the part of world Jewry, increasingly aware that Jews had been abandoned and must resort to taking matters into their own hands. So when news did begin to spread throughout the world of the remarkable, unexpected, and surprising turn of events, the actual coverage of the revolt was varied, and it ranged in tone from restrained to, in some places, completely exuberant. Depending on the types of coverage, here you can see something that was published in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which during the war faced difficulties during the war, both reporting the news and then having its stories picked up, to the general press like the New York Times, which consistently underreported atrocities perpetrated against Jews, and the Jewish press, which tended to be segmented according to different political ideologies. On April 23rd, 1943, as you can see here in front of you, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency delivered the first news of the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, relaying a report that had been received in Stockholm the day before with the headline, quote, "Nazis start mass execution of Warsaw Jews on Passover, victims broadcast SOS." And for the Jewish Daily Vorwärts, for example, which was the largest publication, Jewish circulation daily in New York with 250,000 copies circulated daily, the Holocaust was the story and attracted a great deal of attention. So the Vorwärts on April 23rd made the beginning of the uprising its cover story. And here you can see the Yiddish cover. Nazi schechten euch letzte Jiden in Warschau, which means the Nazis slaughter the last Jews of Warsaw. And beneath it cites the same secret radio reports. The Nazis lead the last 35,000 Jews to the slaughter. And for those of you who can read the Hebrew, it uses the word shchita, which is the Hebrew word to refer to slaughter. In the Vorwärts, the Jewish Daily Forward, like the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the secret radio report was also cited, and the article also noted that the massacre began just as Jews around the world marked the, quote, Festival of Freedom, a reference to Passover. And then again on April 25th, 1943, the Vorwärts reported, sorry, I don't have this here, but I'll just cite it for you, reported that Jews, quote, are fighting with weapons against the Nazis. Those who are currently mounting the resistance are the healthiest and most militant Jews who remain in Warsaw after the Nazis had carried out the great mass murder and deportation last fall. The weapons with which Jews are fighting were provided by the Polish underground movement, which also sent trained commanders to this last battle. Now, a note here about this reporting. In April of 1943, most Jews around the world believed that there were no Jews left in the Warsaw Ghetto. They thought that everyone had been slaughtered. So they were shocked to find out that some Jews remained and that they had organized a revolt. And they had no understanding of how these Jews could have obtained weapons or organized military resistance. This line about trained commanders being sent in from a Polish underground was completely erroneous, but also understandable in trying to figure out how they might have been able to organize the revolt. In Israel, reporting in the newspaper of the Israel Workers Movement, Davar, which you can see here, a couple of headlines from it, which was edited by one of the leaders of labor Zionism, Beryl Katz-Nelson, paralleled reports that had come out in the Vorwärts, while also emphasizing what they saw as the continued connection between underground Zionist activists in Poland and the movement in Geneva and the Yishuv. The headlines, which you can see here, describe the fighting Jews of Warsaw as both the She'erit HaPleta, those are the first two words in the top line, the surviving remnant of European Jewry, and as the rebels, the Mitmardim, fighting the Nazis. Like the forward, Davar reported, again mistakenly, that trained officers from the Polish underground had been sent to the ghetto to help, quote, manage the defense there, unquote. And while coverage in the Jewish press continued to highlight the revolt, along with news on the other fronts of the war effort, and here you can see this is the reporting in the New York Times just a few days after the revolt. By Monday, May 10th, so just a few weeks after the revolt had broken out, the Vorwärts added a new trope in its coverage. And so that was the New York Times. This is the Jewish Chronicle in London. Warsaw Ghetto Battle, Jews went down fighting. Nazis use tanks. And then you can see here in the forwards, just a couple of weeks later, they added a new trope to their coverage in Warsaw, reporting on what they described as, in Yiddish, the Jiddische Helden von Warschau, the Jewish heroes of Warsaw. And there were other Jewish newspapers in New York which also began to pick up on this trope of heroism. Shmuel Margoshes, who was the editor of a newspaper called Der Tog, noted what he described, or what we would describe today, as his suspicions of fake news, right? He assumed that this story had been concocted by the Nazis to justify crushing the ghetto. As he wrote on May 12, 1943, how was it possible for what he described as unarmed Jews to stand up, even for so short a time, against the greatest military machine the world had ever seen? When he first heard about it, he didn't report on it because he didn't believe that it was possible. Now, as the Jewish press began the search for the Jewish heroes of Warsaw, with reports indicating that the fighting there was winding down, reporting on Warsaw and the Bermuda Conference shifted to a new focus: the death of the Bundes activist in London, Shmuel Ziegelboim. And this is the coverage in the forwards after he died. Shmuel Ziegelboim tot in London. Shmuel Ziegelboim is dead in London. Ziegelboim had been a prominent Polish interwar Bundist, and after leaving Warsaw for New York, he became the Bund's representative in the Polish National Council in London, an advisory body to the Polish government in exile. Upon hearing news of the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto and the aftermath of the revolt in the spring of 1943, Ziegelboim committed suicide in protest over the world's lack of action to prevent the mass murder of the Jews. By May 14th, that is just about 4 weeks after and just a few days after he committed suicide, the forwards indicated that Ziegelboim's death was a suicide after he learned of the murder of his wife and daughter in the ghetto. And the Times obituary, which you saw there, was published on May 15th, 1943. So here we're still just about a month after the revolt. In contrast to the glowing tributes to Ziegelboim in the Yiddish and Jewish socialist press, coverage in the labor Zionist press of Ziegelboim's suicide was muted and even critical. A May 21st, 1943 eulogy written in Davar wrote disparagingly of Ziegelboim as, quote, a second-rate politician, a Bund apparatchik, a rigid fanatic, and was critical of his choice to commit suicide, al Kiddush Hashem, much like the head of the Judenrat, Adam Chernyakov, who took his own life at the start of the Great Deportation. And we can discuss this further on. There was a great deal of political competition between the Jewish socialists and the Zionists, both before the war, during the war, and then after the revolt, to take credit for the uprising. The Forwards published an article on Saturday, May 29th, 1943, offering further detail on who the actual leaders of the revolt had been. They noted 200 Jews led thousands of young people, older men, women, and children, radicals, Orthodox, and other groups in battle against the Nazis, noting that while it's impossible to discover the truth, it's clear that a great bloody battle has taken place. By the end of May 1943, further details on the dramatic fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto began to emerge. On May 24th, 1943, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency reported on secret reports that had been delivered to the British Parliament through a representative in London, Ignacy Schwarzbart, that had been conveyed to him and Shmuel Ziegelboim by the Jewish National Committee in Warsaw. And this included secret communiques that had been drafted on the outside of the ghetto by members of the Jewish underground that they had managed to either smuggle outside or telegraph to agents outside of occupied Europe. And we can discuss how this process actually worked. These communiques gave great details on what happened in the first 10 days of the revolt, and were used to fill in a lot of the details on the uprising itself. And this is the headline that I just cited from the forwards at the end of May 1943. 200 Jews lead the battle in the Warsaw Ghetto. These cables, and here you can see one of the telegrams that was sent from London, added a great deal of further detail to the dramatic saga of the revolt, and clarified that, quote, particularly stiff resistance was put up by several thousand Jews who barricaded themselves in the underground storehouses of the ghetto. After 9 days of bombardment and siege, with 1,000 Nazis killed, this is what was covered in the report or detailed in the report. We can discuss from a historical standpoint how much of this was accurate. The report added that, quote, the heroic resistance of the Warsaw Ghetto continues with a few strongholds holding out. The report also began to fill in critical details on the, quote, heroic fighting, identifying the existence of a Jewish fighting organization which shows great ingenuity and courage. And in these early reports, which begin to come out of Warsaw just about a month after the revolt, they also offered a name, Klepfish, who was an engineer, one of the pillars of the determined resistance. He died like a hero. At the same time, as news of the deaths and names of the heroes began to emerge, memorial services were also organized. So in the Yishuv in Palestine, Tzivia Lubetkin, who you can see here on the right, and Tosia Altman, who you can see on the left, were eulogized in June of 1943 after it was believed that they had both died in the uprising. In the words of the leader of the leftist Zionist youth movement Hashomer Tzair, Meir Ya'ari, said, these two women, quote, saved our dignity. They are legends, unquote. Now, ironically, Tzivia Lubetkin actually survived the revolt and managed to escape from the Warsaw Ghetto, as did Tosia Altman. Tosia died a few weeks after the uprising. Tzivia managed to survive till the end of the war and make her way to Palestine after the war was over. On June 3rd, 1943, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and this is from Palestine during the war, a memorial service for these two women that was held, believing that they had both died in the revolt. Now, on early June 1943, the JTA reported that London's Evening Standard already, so this is just about 6 weeks after the revolt, proposed making April 19th of every year a so-called, quote, Jewish Day. April 19th, they wrote, the day when human valor converted the Warsaw Ghetto into a fortress of freedom should be an honored day among men cherishing mercy and tolerance. Jews are fighting today on all fronts for the cause of humanity, and the Jew will be among the proud participants of common victory. 2 weeks later, on June 16th, 1943, the JTA reported on a planned mass meeting in New York to commemorate the Jewish heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto. The Jewish Labor Committee organized the Saturday evening, June 19th mass meeting at Carnegie Hall, so 2 months after the uprising broke out, to celebrate the heroes and to honor Shmuel Ziegelboim, featuring speakers like the Polish ambassador, Stephen S. Wise, the president of the American Jewish Congress, Adolf Held, the chairman of the Jewish Labor Committee, and others. And here you can see Lucy Schildkret, who would later be Lucy Davidovich, recalled the June 19th, 1943 service in her memoirs. As she wrote, we went and we wept, yet there was pride in what Polish Jews had done. For the first time anywhere during the German occupation of Europe, a civilian population had taken up arms against their German oppressors, not just any civilian population, but the most oppressed, the most helpless, the most desperate. In the next weeks, Bundes and Zionist underground reports from Warsaw reaching the West gave details of the fighting and listed the names of the dead and the few survivors. And further on, she noted, the events of the Warsaw Ghetto burned into my consciousness. The Warsaw Ghetto became a constant part of my internal life. I used to imagine myself there, test myself as to how I would have behaved. Would I have had the courage to fight? Would I have had the stamina against despair? Writing in the labor Zionist publication, the Jewish Frontier, Marie Sirkin, who would later write Blessed is the Match, one of the first books in English on the Jewish resistance, also wrote in 1943 of a desire to know the identities of the heroes. And here she singled out the example of Tzivia Lubetkin, who she described as Tzivia Lubetkin the mother, the mama. She was not old, nor did she have children of her own. She lost her life at the age of 28 as a leader of the ghetto's final battle. Young as she was the mother by virtue of strength and solicitude of the crushed, the abandoned, the helpless. Now, what Sirkin did not know at the time, however, was that Lubetkin had in fact survived. As a group of approximately 40 surviving ghetto fighters who had managed to sneak out of the ghetto through the sewers on May 10th, 1943, with Simcha Rotem, whose code name was Kajik, escaped after the Mila 18 bunker had been gassed. And indeed, Tzivi Lubetkin, Tosia Altman, Marek Edelman from the Bund, Hirsch Berlinski, Israel Kanal, and Tuvia Bujakovsky were among the initial leaders of this group who managed to escape from the burning ghetto. Yitzhak Zuckerman, who would later become the husband of Tzivi Lubetkin, and at the time was her boyfriend, was the deputy commander of the Jewish Fighting Organization. He had witnessed all the events transpiring on the other side. He had been on the Aryan side of the outside the ghetto in Warsaw, and he was the one who was detailing in the reports what was happening inside the ghetto. After the ghetto was destroyed, after this group had escaped through the sewers, they tried to escape to the forest and then eventually came back to hide in Warsaw on the Aryan side in hiding in apartments. In the weeks and months after the uprising, the surviving ghetto fighters and activists on the Jewish National Committee engaged in a frenzy of activity. They tried to organize relief work, to rescue those Jews who could still be saved, and at the same time, they set out to draft reports of the uprising, first writing reports in June of 1943 that would only reach London and the rest of the free world in February 1944. And here you can see, I'll just show you a few images. So this is actually a picture of Tzivi Lubetkin in June of 1946, delivering her first testimony after she arrived in Palestine after the war. She stood for 8 hours at Kibbutz Yagur and spoke for 8 straight hours about everything that had happened in Warsaw and in the ghetto from the beginning of the war until the end. Here you can see Kajik on the left, who managed to lead a group out of the ghetto through the sewers as Jürgen Stroop and the SS forces were burning down every building, and they managed to crawl out through the sewers 2 days, crawling through unspeakable filth and muck to emerge on the other side of Warsaw and managed to escape. And actually behind Kajik, so this was taken during the war, behind Kajik in this picture, blurry in the background, is Yitzhak Zuckerman. And this is them walking through the streets of Warsaw, pretending to be Polish non-Jews. They would have had fake papers. It's amazing to me that they had someone take their picture. In fact, in Warsaw today, you can actually go to 51 Prosta Street and you can see the site. There is a monument today. You can see the site where they climbed out of the sewers, emerged from the sewers, and managed to escape from the ghetto. And this is Tosia Altman, who I described before, who had played a crucial role as one of the underground couriers and managed to escape with this group from the burning ghetto, was in hiding actually in Warsaw after the revolt in what had been a celluloid factory for the manufacture of film, for photographs and moving pictures. And the factory had caught fire. This is at the end of May, and she was captured after the fire and tortured to death by the Gestapo. And here's another picture of Tzivi Lubetkin. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about the members of the underground and the roles that they played. Here's a picture of Tuvia Bujakovsky, who also managed to survive. And all of these individuals that I'm focusing on here played a crucial role in writing the early history on the Aryan side of Warsaw. They didn't know if they were going to survive the war, and they started writing about everything that had happened to make sure that people knew about what happened in the ghetto. Marek Edelman is another. This is a picture of him after the revolt. In August of 1943, so again, now we're not even 6 months after the revolt, the World Jewish Congress published Lest We Forget, the Massacre of the Warsaw Ghetto, to commemorate the 1-year anniversary of the deportations to Treblinka, which had decimated the largest Jewish population center in Europe. And while the report focused primarily on what was termed the massacre of the Warsaw Ghetto and included very detailed information on the process of the roundups in Warsaw and on the physical layout of Treblinka, the report also concluded, however, with the basic information that was known then about the revolt in the Warsaw Ghetto, led by a small Jewish fighting organization with minimal arms who managed to hold off the Germans for 4 weeks in what they termed a tragic struggle. And as they wrote, the ghosts of the heroes of the ghetto battle will forever honor the streets Nalewki, Novolipki, Karmelitska, Mila, but persistent reports in the press in spring and summer 1943 indicate not only that their spirit, but also their successors survive and carry on the fight there. The curtain may not have rung down yet. Even with these without detailed reports of the underground in hand, we can see in real time the beginning of 2 simultaneous processes with the uprising: politicization and mythologization, if that's a word. An attempt to not only politicize, but also to mythologize the revolt. So beyond newspaper coverage and rallies over the course of 1943, news about the uprising began to be interpreted in broader public settings. And at the same time, this process of mythologizing and indeed fictionalizing the heroism of the uprising began to enable diverse audiences to imagine themselves in the same situation. And here I just want to show you, so this is from November of 43, a report that was actually smuggled out of Warsaw that eventually made it to London and then to New York and then to Tel Aviv. And this is a report that not only detailed the fighting in the ghetto, but also gave lists of who all the fighters were, which was very important, and what movements they belonged to. So this would have reached London and New York and then Tel Aviv in February of 1944. And here they list about 245 fighters. I'm going to skip ahead these reports. So Adolf Berman was head of the Jewish National Committee on the Zionist side. Leon Feiner was a prominent Bundist. Each of them were writing their own reports for their political movements, detailing what had happened in the Warsaw Ghetto, trying to play up their own movement's prominent role in leading the revolt. Now, at the same time that all of this is happening, the politics of sort of who organized the revolt, we also see this attempt to mythologize it. So in October of 1943, a few days before Yom Kippur that year, a radio play that was called The Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto was first broadcast on NBC Radio as part of the Eternal Light series. This play had been written by Morton Wishegrad, and it told the story of a fictional fighter by the name of Isaac Davidson, a fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto who had lost his family in the deportations. Isaac explained in the play that after the Great Deportation, quote, "we no longer asked for rescue and for mercy, we asked for weapons." And he wrote, "There was silence. You did not answer." He relates in the play how dynamite, rifles, and grenades were smuggled through the sewers, again repeating this idea that had been delivered by the Polish underground to Jews in the ghetto, until April 19th, 1943, when 35,000 Jewish men, women, and children stood ready to greet a detachment of stormtroopers in light tanks. After wiping out the entire detachment, the Jewish fighters battled SS troops as, quote, "flags of the United Nations floated over the roofs of the ghetto, and Jewish engineers exploded 8,000 factories producing material for Germany." Now, just to note, this is an interesting process of how we can see some reporting that was factual become fictionalized. So what we know is that the revisionist Zionists, who were also fighting in the ghetto, in the northern part of the ghetto, on the first day of the revolt, they raised 2 flags above a building in Murnovsky Square. One was a Zionist flag, a blue and white flag with a Magen David in the middle, and one was a Polish national flag. But what's interesting is you can see how in the subsequent retelling of it, all sorts of different flags get incorporated. And here, Visegrad focuses on the flag of the United Nations, which doesn't actually make any sense historically. But as he writes, the entire ghetto was in flames, but the Jews continued to fight. After 37 days, a few Jews with guns fighting a Nazi army for 37 days. And here you can see a picture of Morton Wisograd. Jeffrey Chandler, who's a professor at Rutgers, has written about this historic broadcast, and he describes it as the first mainstream dramatic representation of the uprising 6 months after the revolt, the battle, and just days before the high holidays. And as you could see on the previous page, the response was so overwhelming that the program was aired again for Hanukkah in December of 1943. It seemed appropriate, right? Maccabees, the few against the many, tell the story of the modern day Maccabees, the Jews fighting against the Nazis. The play situated the heroic struggle within a religious framework, making use of ritual music, biblical language, and imagery. An unnamed voice likened the victims of the Warsaw Ghetto to the scapegoats of the centuries and recalled the Leviticus descriptions of release of goats into the wilderness. But for them in the Warsaw Ghetto, there was no wilderness, only the abyss. Now, while artists, writers, and composers sought to channel the symbolic power of the revolt to dramatize its significance for audiences, political leaders in the Yishuv and in London and New York began to debate its political meaning as the search for heroes who would organize the revolt, along with the sources for their inspiration, took on added weight. So Jewish leaders in New York, London, and the Yishuv played a key role in both interpreting the events for a broader Jewish audience eager to learn the identities of the heroes and to shape the collective memory of the event for a Jewish public trying to imagine what it would have been like to take part in the revolt. In New York and in the United States on April 19th, 1944, the date of April 19th became an anniversary to hold memorial services around the world. And in advance of the anniversary, the United States State Department issued a message stating no finer page had been written in the long history of the Jews than the battle waged by unarmed men, women, and children against the brutal Nazi murderers. The heroic defenders of the Warsaw Ghetto has strengthened the spirit of free peoples resolved upon the extinction of Nazi tyranny and the liberation of all oppressed peoples. JTA reported in advance of the anniversary that the first anniversary of the heroic resistance of the Jews in the ghetto will be commemorated, and was commemorated with mass demonstrations, with memorial services, with mournings, with work stoppages, with special prayers written by the Synagogue Council of America, and more. Here you can see a picture on the first anniversary in New York. Over 30,000 Jews gathered in New York City before the steps of City Hall to hear speeches by Mayor LaGuardia and prominent Jewish leaders. Joseph Proskauer was the president of the American Jewish Committee, issued a statement about Jewish heroism and the ways in which Jews were contributing to the war effort. And the Forverts also covered these huge demonstrations that took place. Now, you can see here in this picture of Mayor LaGuardia, Rabbi Rubenstein on the steps of City Hall in New York, and near them were the poet Julian Tuvim and the Polish Jewish artist Arthur Szyk. Tuvim, the exiled Polish Jewish poet who had written the poem We Polish Jews in New York in April of 1944, anticipated the monument that would be created by Natan Rapaport in Warsaw, dedicated on the 5th anniversary of the revolt on April 19th, 1948, calling for a new monument to be added to the national shrine that would honor the Jewish heroes. And the Polish Jewish artist, Arthur Szyk, who had arrived in New York, and let me see if I have a picture here, you can look at this, who had arrived in New York in 1940 and almost single-handedly led an artistic effort to convince the American public to support the war effort, created this image of the repulsed attack to commemorate the first anniversary of the revolt. The image appeared in numerous publications. This is the cover page of Our Journal in English. It was in the Forverts, it was in numerous other places. And it noted that this image was created to remember the heroic struggle of our brothers in Warsaw. And indeed, his image depicted only male fighters triumphant over the fallen SS, wearing the Star of David as a mark of pride, not a badge of shame. While Szyk did not depict any female fighters, by then, as I've said, the names of Tosia Altman, Tzvi Lebetkin, Topsha Davidovich, and others had been reported in various places, He did depict the revolt as a popular uprising, reflecting a cross-section of the Jewish population, as you can see here, young and old, religious and secular, middle class and working class, among the Jewish fighters. And while Jews in New York and London marked the first anniversary with large-scale demonstrations that included the broader non-Jewish public, linking the heroism of the ghetto fighters with the suffering of the Jewish martyrs, commemorations that took place on that first anniversary in the Yishuv in Palestine were more muted, more ambivalent. They weren't sure how connected the Zionist groups had been to the revolt. They weren't sure how to mark it, how to celebrate it. So this is an interesting thing. How do we account for this discrepancy between commemorations 1 year after the revolt? In the United States, American Jewish leaders could present the revolt in the Warsaw Ghetto as part of the Jewish contribution to the war effort, as the outcry of the oppressed who refused to perish under the heel of fascism and would join the Allied cause to defeat Nazism. This is how it was celebrated by the Jewish Labor Bund, by the Jewish Labor Committee, and by other groups. But I'll skip down here, and I think it's interesting. One of the important things that ends up happening is the Zionists realize that the prominent role that their members were taking in the revolt itself was being underplayed by other groups, as the name of Michal Klepfish and Bundes leaders were the ones who were being celebrated. And Yitzhak Zuckerman, who was still in occupied Warsaw at the time, was very well aware of this. And so he went to work drafting his report of what had happened in the Warsaw Ghetto to make clear exactly who the identities of the fighters were in Warsaw. And in fact, you can see here on May 24th, 1944, they drafted about 120 pages of correspondence, documentation that was photographed and put onto microfilm and sent in a parcel of documents that added further details on the history of the Jewish fighting organization, the course of the fighting in the revolt, and the identities of the ghetto fighters, specifically at this time naming Mordechai Yanilevich as the commander of the revolt. So this is about a little more than a year after the revolt had been crushed by Stroop, and this microfilm was delivered with 120 pages on it that finally enabled the Zionist movement to take credit for leading the revolt, detailing the role played by Zionist groups in the revolt and the leadership of Mordechai Yanilevich as commander of the Jewish fighting organization. Now, in the interest of time and to make sure that we are able to leave time for Q&A, I'll just skip ahead to show you that there is a great deal of competition that's going on between Zionist groups 1 year after, now we're into the second half of 1944, Bundes groups, each one listing their members. Was it Zionists who led the revolt? Was it Jewish socialists who led the revolt? Was it a broad popular uprising, or was it just trained fighters from Zionist youth movements who led the revolt? And here you can see on the 5th anniversary of the uprising on April 19th, 1948, the monument created by Natan Rapaport was dedicated. And what we can see in the dedication of this monument is that by this point in time, it was the Zionist hero Mordechai Yanilevich who would be the celebrated hero of the revolt. Just a couple of words in closing. At the same time, the heroic saga of the revolt was mythologized in a manner that captured the attention of Jews around the world, allowing them to imagine what it might have been like to be there, engaged in the struggle against the Nazi oppressor. Surely the Jewish heroes of Warsaw were motivated by a desire to engage in self-defense, not to save their lives, but to save their own dignity. But were they motivated by a Zionist connection to the land of Israel that inspired the revolt against diaspora oppression? Or did they rise up in defense of Poland and the ideals of democracy, the universal brotherhood of man, and the rights of the working classes to resist totalitarianism? Or were the fighters united by a drive to take revenge and simply kill Nazis? Either way, it is clear that the revolt was too powerful a symbol to not be seized upon by Jews from across the ideological spectrum well before the war was over. The timing of the uprising, coinciding with the transition to memorialization and mourning, also solidified the event as a date to remember both the heroes and martyrs of Warsaw and of European Jewry more broadly. After the war, the symbolic power of the revolt would be marshaled by the Zionist movement to support the struggle for the creation of the Jewish state after the Shoah. And you can see here the two sides of the monument to the ghetto heroes. On the one side, the actors in history emerging out from the stone, bursting forth as actors, taking control of their own history. And on the other side, Rapaport renders the notion of Jewish passivity into stone. And these two stand as counterpoints to one another. And we can discuss how that has continued to dominate the subsequent history of how we not only talk about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but also talk about Jewish behavior during the war. But Paul, I'm going to stop myself there because I think I've gone on for a little bit more than 40 minutes, and I'd be very happy to take questions now.
Great, thank you so much. Avi, do you want to stop the screen sharing? There we go. Then this way I can, okay. So first of all, thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation. We have a couple questions that came in already, and I'm gonna to read those to you. So one of the questions that came in, and I know more will come in also, how many German and Ukrainian auxiliaries were killed? And was that discussed in the commemorations?
Yes. Okay. Good question. So this is a really interesting question, and it's actually kind of hard to piece this together accurately. And I'm going to tell you why it's a little bit hard to piece it together accurately. If we look at Jürgen Stroop's report on the fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto, he consistently underreports the number of his troops, and this makes sense that he would underreport the number of German soldiers each day. And actually, this is publicly available. You can go in and look on each day how many Germans were killed, how many Ukrainian auxiliaries were killed, how many Polish police officers might have been killed. And he has numbers that are, less than 50. Now, that counterpoint to that is on the reports that come from the Jewish side, where I just told you that they say that they've killed 1,000 Germans. And that Michael Klepfish, on the second day of the revolt, explodes a mine and that was his job. He was an explosives expert, and he explodes a mine as Germans are marching into the ghetto and kills over 100 just in that way. There's over 100 casualties. So I say that because the numbers are wildly different in terms of how many we estimate how many Germans died. And I'll be honest with you, it's a little bit difficult to know exactly. It's even more complicated than that, not just in terms of how it's reported by the Jewish fighters, how it's reported by Jürgen Stroop and his reports to his superiors, because these daily communiques that I mentioned, that Zuckerman, who's on the outside of the ghetto, and Adolf Berman, who's outside of the ghetto, and Leon Feiner, who's outside the ghetto, they also have an audience of the Polish underground. And I think there's even a question that's coming in about the Polish underground. They are writing for an audience of the Polish underground to try to convince them to support the Jews and the fighting. So they are going to be motivated to say that it's going better than perhaps it was, to try to convince the Polish underground to join the fighting. And the Polish underground, for their part, basically, makes the strategic assessment that it doesn't make any sense to fight back against the Germans at this time, that they would be better off waiting to organize the revolt, as they do, until August of 44, when the Soviets are just across the river, and it seems more likely that they will have success against pushing back the Germans and forcing a German retreat. So the Polish underground, and this is why the Zionists and the Bundes end up working closely together during the revolt. The Bundes have much better relationship with the Polish underground. They're much more likely to be able to get weapons from the Poles, and so the Zionists need their help to get weapons from the Poles. But they're not very successful. There's a lot of bitterness on the part of the Jewish underground at the lack of willingness of the Poles to give up any of their weapons to help the Jews in their fight. So in terms of involvement, they help with publicity, they help with spreading the word about what's happening. there's not a lot of help in terms of arming the underground, as was mistakenly reported at the time.
And thank you. So I have a couple more questions. Somebody asked who was Marek Edelman, and another person asked if you could say a word or two about Vlad Kamid.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, great. I'm going to go back to my share for a second because I want to show you a picture of Edelman. And in this, so let me just go back here to my picture of Marek Edelman. And in a longer version of this presentation and in the book project, I have a whole chapter where I look at, there's Edelman. I have a whole chapter where I look at the first testimonies that were published in 1945 and 46 after the revolt. And so one is a testimony of Marek Edelman that's called The Ghetto Fights. One is the one of Tzivi Lebetkin that I mentioned earlier that she delivers in the Yishuv in 1946. And the other one is Vlad Kamid. And so both Marek Edelman and Vlad Kamid were members of the Bundist, that is the Jewish Socialist Underground in Warsaw. Vladka, who some of you might be familiar with, who becomes one of the most prominent voices in Holocaust education in New York and Holocaust commemoration in New York and the United States. In fact, is one of the driving forces behind the creation of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. She arrives in New York in June of 1946. So she is a courier for the Bund. She's in Warsaw during the uprising. Before the uprising, she was going in and out of the ghetto. When the uprising begins, she's outside the ghetto, trying to report, trying to deliver assistance to the Jews who are inside the ghetto. When she gets to New York in June of 1946, she actually begins writing a series for the Forverts that's called Vladka Speaks, that over the course of 6 months, she tells her story, exactly what happened to her during the revolt and after the revolt. And that becomes the basis of her memoir that's called On Both Sides of the Wall, which becomes her memoir that tells her extraordinary account of what happened to her before and during and after the revolt. Marek Edelman, I'll just say, if you're able to get a copy, and actually these are pretty easily available online too, people have put copies of this online. His account, The Ghetto Fights, which he writes already right after the war in 1945, first in Polish, and then it's translated into English, is an incredible account of the uprising, the ghetto fights, and it's an account of the period before the revolt and during the revolt. And I say it's incredible because Edelman is one of the leaders of the uprising. So there are various groups in the ghetto. Later, Zuckerman and Edelman are sort of skeptical of this, cynical about this idea that Anilevich becomes known as the leader of the revolt. They're like, he wanted to be called the leader, but it didn't mean that he had any more training than anybody else. He didn't have any military training. And Edelman was responsible for leading one battalion of troops in the ghetto under the, and had been a member of the Bundist underground. And he manages to escape through the sewers with Tzivia. He writes what I think is really an incredible account of the uprising and the ghetto fights, because he pays a great deal of attention not only to how the resistance is organized and how the ghetto fighters work together, but he also is very sensitive to the experiences of the Jewish masses in the ghetto. He pays a lot of attention to their experiences. He writes a lot about, and all of the ghetto fighters after the war talk about why it was so difficult to organize resistance and armed resistance until later. And one of the major points they talk about is that no one believed that boarding the trains meant that you were going to have a certain death, because it defied reason. It defied, sort of, everybody wanted to believe that they could survive another way, and the Nazis employed such deception until the end. And so Edelman kept talking about the ghetto refused to believe, the ghetto did not believe. And he described sort of these very poignant moments about sort of the experiences of Jews in the ghetto in the period before and during the deportations, and then what remained after the deportations. And it's a searing account of what happened during the revolt. And just one other note, Edelman actually stays, so you can see this picture of him from 1946, actually with a visitor from the United States. He's taking him around the ghetto. Yankov Pat, not maybe a distant relative of mine, not a close relative, who writes an account called Ash and Fire, and Edelman is his tour guide through the destroyed ruins of Warsaw. And then Edelman stays in Poland for the rest of his life and becomes a member of the Solidarity movement, and is like dedicated to this idea of Poland.
Thank you so much. I think I'm just going to see if there's any more questions, and it looks like oh, there was just one other question. Well, I think you answered it, but I'll just roll it out again, which is where did the arms come from? Oh, and another two questions, and then we should wrap up. So first of all, where did the arms come from? Which you did allude to, but if you could answer it directly. And then another comment that you did not mention, Oneg Shabbos.
Right. So I usually, that's the first thing that I talk about when I talk about sort of the history of the Warsaw Ghetto. And I'm glad that you bring this up about the Oneg Shabbos and Emanuel Ringelblum. And for those who have not either read Sam Kassow's book about Who Will Write Our History or seen the incredible documentary, you really, really should. I will just mention in this context that Ringelblum actually plays a really important role. So Ringelblum, just for those who do not know, is a Polish Jewish historian, social welfare activist, actually works for the Joint Distribution Committee, and when the war breaks out, helps to organize all these social welfare activities in the ghetto, and most importantly, organizes this documentation project that becomes known as the Underground Archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, or the Oneg Shabbos Archive. And it's an incredible attempt to document everything that transpired in the ghetto, because Ringelblum, as a historian, he knew that victors write the history, and that someday the Nazis were already denying, and that deniers would be able to say none of this ever happened, and Jews had a responsibility to preserve a record of what had happened. And so it's an incredible effort to preserve, and it succeeds. The 25 main activists in the Oneg Shabbos archive, only 2 of them survive until the end of the war, but they bury these treasures underground in the Warsaw Ghetto. And one of the members, so Ringelblum is actually very closely involved with the underground, closely involved with the Jewish Fighting Organization, gets to know, actually when he died in March of 1944, so he survives the revolt, is sent to a forced labor camp. The underground helps him to escape from the forced labor camp. He comes back to Warsaw and is actually caught hiding in a bunker on the Aryan side of Warsaw in March of 44. And at the time, he is working together with Adolf Berman to write these reports of what happened in Warsaw. So some of those reports that I talked about, Ringelblum is part of that. He's also writing an account. He's writing a profile of Mordechai Neilevich to make sure that his sort of role is known for posterity. And he's also writing as much as he can until he's caught. And he also writes this last letter about Yiddish culture in the ghetto. So sort of an incredible figure, and I'm glad that the question brought it up. What's interesting is that, in talking about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, we have this case of a focus on armed resistance, which in many respects comes to obscure sort of other aspects of the history, like the spiritual resistance that we were just talking about, or documentation projects. And I think it's important, right? Because a lot of the important work that is now being done to talk about other aspects of how Jews lived and, resisted in other ways through types of spiritual resistance for many years after the war are obscured or overshadowed by the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising itself.
Wow. Well, listen, thank you so much for really a wonderful presentation. And it's so great to have a drill down into the uprising and what happened and how the uprising was used, and a sense of the various groups and how they were competing with one another for really the memory and the understanding of what had happened. So I want to thank you. I want to also thank Joanna Aruda, who is helping us tonight from the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And I want to thank everybody for attending. I hope that you'll join us for our subsequent programs, the Fania Goddesfeld Heller Conference, Sunday the 13th and then the 20th, and also Martin Dean, who'll be speaking on the 19th about Bob and Yar. So I want to wish everybody a good night, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.